welcome to 15 Minutes in Canberra. I'm Hayley Channer, Senior Policy Fellow with the Perth US Asia Centre. A very special episode today. We are talking about failure and disappointment. And for this episode, I'm joined by two guests that have previously spoken with the podcast. Raoul Heinrichs from right at the beginning of this year, and also Lisa Sharland. And I'm not going to do a large intro for either of them. Raoul still works for Lockheed Martin, and Lisa works for the Stimson Centre. And importantly, they're two very close friends of mine, so I feel comfortable talking with them about this more sensitive topic. And because it's been a big year of lots of failures and disappointments for a lot of people who've had to either cancel things or reschedule things or postpone things because of COVID lockdowns, I thought it would be a useful time to reflect on our own careers and at times when things haven't really gone to plan, because even the best laid plans don't always go the way you'd hoped that they would. And often I think it's important to reflect on these times because in the moment it can feel really hard and horrible and you just never want to remember it. But in the long run, I think a lot of times when you do fail or have a misstep, it can teach you a lot about yourself in terms of how you handle it and bounce back. And sometimes it can even set you off on a slightly different career path than what you had thought you wanted for yourself. So, Lisa and Raoul, welcome. Thank you for exposing all of your failures with me and for podcast podcast audience, I mean.
No problem, Hayley. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks very much for having us, Hayley. I'm definitely well acquainted with failure and disappointment, so I feel like I'm on the right show.
Oh, good. I'm going to kick off because there's so much I have to say, so many experiences that have been really unpleasant in the moment, but yeah, it is nice to reflect back on them because I'm happy now. I love the job where I am. I love the people that I work with, and I finally feel like I'm in the right place, the place I'm meant to be. But definitely in the past, there have been times when just repeated rejections for things, and I really did feel like I was in the wrong place and didn't know where I was headed with my career. And there was a lot of self-doubt because I think when you have say you're applying for a job somewhere and you just don't get it and you put a lot of effort into it, it's almost like before you're thinking of buying a house, when you imagine yourself living in the house and you imagine the life you're going to have for yourself, when you apply for a job, you're doing a similar sort of thing where you're imagining what that career would be like. And if you have to move, for instance, like a lot of people do to come and take a position in Canberra, you have to imagine a new life for yourself. So you kind of invest a lot in it. And especially for people in our fields, a lot of the time it's people are recruited through selection criteria. And so there's a lot of early investment in jobs before you're even offered an interview. And so for people who are looking to have a career, say, working for a government department like DFAT or Department of Defence, or really any APS role, including in federal or state governments, and I think too, Raoul, I mean, you're in the private sector. I wonder if this is the same there, where you have to write answers, very detailed answers to set questions, which provide, you need to provide examples of things that you've done in the past. And if you're at the beginning of your career, sometimes you don't have a lot of those examples to use. So it can be almost like you're pipped at the gate even before you get out. So, yeah, I did want to reflect on a couple of instances in my career and also what it taught me about those failures in terms of what I could learn for next time, and then also what it taught me about myself personally. One of the earliest ones was around this whole area of selection criteria. I had been working in a position for about 18 months, and the way I got the position was through a recruitment agency. And I was really loving the role, liked the people that I worked with, and it worked out really well for me because it was part-time and I was at uni at that time. And after this 18-month period, my position came up again where I had to reapply for it, and it was advertised externally. And there was like a slight bump in the pay. So it was also really enticing because I thought, oh, fantastic. I've got 18 months of experience doing this job. Surely I am going to be the person that they pick for this job. But at the time, the problem was I had never done selection criteria. I wasn't familiar with selection criteria. And I didn't realize that, if you write down on paper an answer to a question saying, yes, I can do this, that really doesn't tell the selection panel anything. It just tells them that you think you can do it, not demonstrating that you think you can do it. So, yeah, I applied for this job that I had already been in, and lo and behold, I didn't get it. And I was pretty shocked and really upset about it. And that was my first experience with dealing with selection criteria. So right off the bat, I hated it. I was like, selection criteria is silly, doesn't really tell you about the person. I just wanted to get in front of people so that they would like me immediately, and they wouldn't even need the selection criteria. But, cast forward several years, and I'm much better at doing selection criteria now. There is a real process and knack to doing it properly. And I think, government websites will offer you some examples of how to do it properly, and, you can put that all into practice. But then you still might not get an interview, and even if you do get an interview, you might not get selected. So I wanted to talk about this other experience that I had. Probably when I reflect back, it has to be one of the worst times in my entire career. So I was in a job that I didn't feel was right for me. I had been there for a while, and I was very eager to leave. I was eager to move on. And so I put a lot of effort into job applications. I applied for 5 different jobs in different areas. So they weren't all at the same department. So it was really, I was sort of giving a broad brush approach to looking for this new position. And I was very successful at getting interviews. So for those 5 positions, I actually ended up being invited to 8 different job interviews. So there were a couple of follow-up interviews, and I was getting very good at interviews at this point because I'd also practiced with my friends, which I hate doing. Like, I hate practicing. It's so embarrassing when you have to, in front of your friends, pretend to be in a job interview. And yeah, the interviews went really well, obviously, because I got some follow-up interviews. And I think a mistake I made too was to expect that of the 5 jobs, there was a good chance I was going to get offered one. And yes, it turned out that I wasn't offered a single one of those 5 jobs.
Oh, Hayley.
And the worst part too was the very last one that I was waiting to hear back from, which had, just by coincidence, been my favourite one out of the 5. They told me I'd hear within about 3 days of the final interview whether or not I got it. And I'd had a really good rapport with everyone who had interviewed me. And yeah, Canberra is just one of those really small places where I was at an event at the Australian National University, and I bumped into an old colleague of mine, and I said, "Oh, what are you doing these days?" And he proceeded to tell me that he'd just been given a new job, and to tell me the job that it was, which was the one I had interviewed for and was waiting to hear back from them on. So yeah, to hear from the successful candidate that therefore I am the unsuccessful candidate was pretty horrible. And also, I think because I was so desperate to leave the job that I was in, it hit me even harder because I realised that not only had I not been selected, I was kind of trapped. And it was very much one of those situations where I don't know why it is that the bedroom floor is a good place to cry, and that I find myself in the stereotype of crying on the bedroom floor. But it happened. And yeah, now that I've got some distance from that whole experience, I learned a lot of things from it. So for starters, I learned that just because you've applied for many jobs doesn't mean you'll get any of them. And so you need to not get your hopes up, and not to have the expectation that just because you've got a lot of feelers out there that something's going to happen from it. And also, I think it really debunked a theory that I'd had that I've got some sort of sixth sense about things and that I can predict what will happen. Because I sort of felt so confident about how some of the interviews had gone. I got a really good vibe coming out of the interviews. And I think that it taught me too that that's not necessarily going to mean you're going to get that job either, just because you got a good vibe about it. Yeah, so I ended up being in the job that I was in for a bit longer, and I really did have to grow up a lot at that point and just be grateful for the fact that I had a secure job at the time and that a lot of other people didn't have that. And that whole period of practicing for interviews and doing lots of different interviews has made me a much better interviewer and like an interviewee, I guess. And also it taught me to, like some of the other job interviews that I've had before that time, for jobs that I was like were my dream job, I would get too nervous in the lead up to the interview because I wanted the job too much. And that came across in the interviews. Whereas jobs that, I've just would like to have, I've been offered because I guess I didn't appear super desperate in the actual interview. So look, that's just a couple of examples. Yeah, I've got a couple of other things about just disappointments or personal failures, which maybe I'll share a bit later. But now that I've spoken so much, I thought I'd throw it over to either one of you to talk about similar experiences, other times where it just hasn't gone the way you thought it would go.
I was just going to, I mean, that's a really an interesting and quite a moving story, Hayley. I was going to ask you, when you think back on the 5, unsuccessful applications, with the advantage of hindsight, do you have any sense of where it was going wrong, or was it just these were just organisations just taking decisions totally outside of your control, and that was it?
I think the competition for jobs has increased, so I think there's more recognition that in particular roles are more sought after, and I guess people who are going to uni and getting university degrees, it's harder to differentiate yourself than it ever has been. And I think too, people that have more experience working in Canberra, working for government departments, just know how to play the game better. I'm originally from Queensland,
right,
and it was more, as I described earlier, you just do things where you come across as a competent, nice person that can get along with people and you win jobs that way. Whereas when you are applying with potentially hundreds of other people, there's not a lot that can separate you. And so I think it wasn't that I wasn't right for those jobs, because I think I could have done those jobs really well to, a very high standard. It was more that there were lots of other people exactly like me, and on that occasion, whatever, ticks needed to go in certain boxes, they have to differentiate you in some way, because sometimes they might have way more qualified people than the positions that they've got. So I guess I was just unlucky at that time, but yeah, it also forced me back into the environment that I was currently in, I actually thought maybe it would destroy my resolve. And for a little while, I didn't apply for any other jobs because I just frankly couldn't face more rejection after that. I was just like, I was a bit tired of the rejection and a bit worried about going back out there to be rejected again. But because I knew it wasn't the right place for me and it just wasn't a good fit, I still tried to leave. So yeah, I was sort of never going to be dissuaded because I just couldn't stay there.
Can I ask, and this is out of genuine curiosity, because I haven't really worked in the public service. I've worked very closely with the public service, but not in it, And I guess one of the things that I've always been a bit mystified by is whether, when external job advertisements are posted, whether in many cases those are really exercises in sort of ticking a box, and in fact somebody who is on the inside perhaps acting in a role, perhaps they've already got a professional relationship with the person seeking to fill the vacancy from another team, whether in some cases, APS jobs are sort of stitched up before the advertisement even hits seek.com,
Look,
are you able to shed any light on that?
Look, my own experience doesn't bear that out, because I was already acting in that earlier role that I got overlooked for because I didn't fill in the selection criteria in the way it needed to be filled out. And so I think it's definitely done in a much more fair way. And just, it is literally sometimes there are too few actual positions for the people who are interested in them. I mean, definitely the personal relationships helps, and I am aware of other people in different roles, not just public service. Actually, I'm aware of someone who's applying for a role outside the public service, and that's exactly the way it's happening, is they're basically advising her to apply for this position so that they can select her for the position. But I haven't seen that happen in the APS. But I don't know, Lisa, you have been in a couple of government affiliated or directly government roles. What's your experience?
Look, it's an interesting question. I mean, look, I know there's so many factors that go into these things, and I was just going to jump on your comment there, Raoul, about ticking the box, because it reminds me of advice I had really early on in my career when I was still at university. And someone said to me, always be cognizant, I guess, of the type of job that you're applying for in the selection process. Is it an organisation that's seeking to effectively just tick off a number of criteria and bring you on board, or is it someone who is looking at you holistically and the skills that you're bringing to the job? And the reason I say that, it's a really vague comment, but I was reflecting ahead of our conversation today, and I've never done well at bulk recruitment rounds. Whenever, even within government, I was working in New York at our Australian mission for several years as locally engaged staff. And for those that aren't familiar with that, it means you are not Australian public service. You are not eligible for sort of internal movement within roles that come up internally. You apply as an external candidate to go back into the public service. Now, I'll be quite blunt. One of the biggest disappointments I had was when I was looking to move back to Canberra and applying for government jobs, effectively at the same level of the work that I was doing in New York at the Australian mission. I didn't even get to interview. I didn't even get asked to interview. And I remember it wasn't quite the bedroom floor, Hayley, but sitting in a New York coffee shop, trying not to cry my eyes out, realising that, it was probably going to take me a little bit longer to get back to Canberra. And woe is me sitting in a New York coffee shop, I know. But nonetheless, when I reflect back, every time I've applied, whether it was legal clerkships that I was applying for in bulk rounds where I didn't get an offer at all from a couple of interviews, whether it was applying for the public service through bulk recruitment rounds, I've really struggled at that. And that may be a reflection of the way I've applied for jobs. It could simply be, what I would say is a range of other factors. And I think when you're starting out in your career, you haven't necessarily had the experience of being on selection panels and seeing how the recruitment process works from the other side. And if anything, I think I found, having had that experience a bit later in my career and seeing all the different decisions that go into hiring people in terms of bringing them into different organisations, it gives you a bit of insight into how that process works, and the fact that there may be, a dozen candidates that are entirely suitable, entirely competent to do the job, and then a whole other range of factors come into play in terms of, prioritising who might get the offer for that job. So I think for me that shed a little bit of light on it. Has it made it easier to get rejected when you apply for things? Absolutely not. I think that's still a really difficult thing to manage. But I think if anything, it showed me that in this field in particular, I think, even looking back on the research internships I've been involved in hiring people for, you realise just how qualified and the range of different skills that people have. And I can only imagine what that looks like trying to come into a graduate recruitment round when you have so many people applying. The difference between someone who might get an offer or someone who might get an interview and someone who doesn't is probably quite negligible in a lot of cases. And I think it's worthwhile keeping that in mind as well.
I wonder also if you just, behind the curtain things that you can't see, that they're looking for a particularly diverse group, and if there's already someone very similar to you and they need some other more diverse experience, like someone who's never worked in the field and they want these other skill sets, you could miss out because you're better qualified than somebody else, or you've got the experience and you haven't got experience outside the field, and they're particularly looking for someone outside the field.
And I guess it all comes back to sort of, what are they looking for in the skill set of the person that they're bringing on board, and where's the emphasis rest on different skills where they might have gaps, and they're things that may not be that transparent in a job advertisement.
Mm. So, Raoul, your turn.
Would you like me to share a story of desultory failure with you?
Yes, I can't wait to hear it. Make it really bad.
Well, there's quite a few. I mean, when people talk about their careers, they often sort of, employ the analogy of climbing a ladder. And some respects, I feel like mine's been the obverse of that. It's sort of, the cartoon depiction of someone falling out of a tree and hitting every branch on the way down, and then sort of nestling in a spot. Maybe I'm being overly dramatic there.
You're saying you've already peaked in your career, and now it's just,
I had an interesting experience very early on in my sort of professional life here in Canberra, which I think did have a very constructive effect and instilled in me a healthy sense of, I think, detachment from professional opportunities. That's not to say don't get excited or get my hopes up and get disappointed, but it was a really bruising experience, and I swore to myself from that point that I was going to kind of almost apply for jobs as an observer, or at least once my application was in, I was going to sort of detach myself from the entire process.
You were going to reject them before they could reject you.
Well, just I think at least submit to the idea that I was not in, from that point on, I was not in control, and it was out of my hands. But so that was a lengthy precursor. So in 2007, I got to Canberra to do my master's in strategic and defence studies at ANU, and very quickly. Within a few weeks, really, of arriving in Canberra, actually, by sheer serendipity, ended up with a cool little internship in then opposition leader Kevin Rudd's office. So one thing led to another, and then that became a kind of, more of a job. And so before I knew it, I sort of arrived in Canberra kind of wide-eyed and ready to study, strategy and defence. And then before I knew it, it felt like I'd kind of fallen into this West Wing-like fairy tale. And the realities of that job were that, it was, everybody knows about what working Kevin Rudd's office was like. I think the reputation sort of precedes it, but it was, there was a fair bit of rough and tumble. And it was I worked really hard. I really, for the first time, I think, well, actually I'd applied myself in honours as well at university, but I really sort of threw myself into it and kind of challenged myself and worked really, really hard. And some of the stories I could tell you from that year, the Kevin 07 campaign, was just wild. Anyway, by the time they won the election and then began the transition into government and began staffing up a proper prime ministerial office. And, naturally enough, I felt like I'd been very loyal. I'd worked really long hours, been part of the team, and I'd been doing speech writing and, really I felt like contributing. I'd been made a real contribution. And a friend of mine actually was overseeing the recruitment of the new PMO. And so I walked in one day, with my CV and went to put it on the desk, and he had a pile of the other CVs that had poured in the meantime. And I had a leaf, a quick leaf through some of them. And, my heart sank a little bit. It was, FAZs and, people with really extensive experience, some really very seasoned people. And it became clear to me very quickly that, I was not going to parlay my hard work from that year into a kind of boy wonder job in the Prime Minister's office writing speeches or advising him, meaningfully on foreign and defence policy. So I packed up my office and out I went. It doesn't sound so bad, but at the time, again, I think over the course of that year, I became really captivated by the whole the political momentum, the sense of change, and just the excitement that is, professional life when you're starting out in Canberra. And so it was a hard come down from that. And as I said, it was one of the lessons I really had to learn was from that point on. To keep my eyes wide open, I guess, and maintain a healthy sense of detachment from things that you weren't in control of.
Well, I don't think you were that far off to expect that you might get a job there, because the number of very, very young staffers that fill the offices of ministers at Parliament House has really surprised me. I didn't realise. I suppose they're people that can dedicate much more of their time than someone that has a family or other commitments. So I don't think you should have felt like you were underqualified for that. They are looking for those kinds of people, but I think there's a lot of luck involved too. Like what you were saying before, Raoul, about whether it's who you know or what you know. I feel like a lot of the time for political office, it's who you know.
Oh, definitely. Although in this case, you're right. You're actually right. I mean, the people that he did take with, some of them were really young, and did carry over. And in this case, weirdly enough, I sort of did know the right people, but it just didn't. It was clear that they were looking for real policy people with deep experience. And
they actually told you no before you packed up your stuff and left?
No, not in so many words, but it was clear. I think, yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't suicide for fear of death. I think I was really. Yeah, it wasn't going to happen. But it was an instructive episode.
Well, I mean, what I've learnt too throughout the whole course of my career too is that luckily for all of us, the failures never end. Like no matter what you're doing.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, if you're, no matter what kind of job you're in, if you're trying new things, which means that you are getting better and advancing your skill set, you're going to fail because you're trying something new and you've never done it before. Like for me, for instance, I really don't like doing media interviews, especially live media interviews for some reason. I don't like the medium, and I don't like that the content is often there's just scratching the surface and it's more about the presentation rather than the substance. But I've had to get really good at that. But there've been a lot of, embarrassing moments along the way that happen in live TV that I can't do anything about because it's happening live. I just have to keep going and pretend like it never happened.
Yeah. Well, I love media interviews. Gore Vidal said, never pass up an opportunity to have sex or go on TV. And, I've tried to sort of uphold the wisdom in there. I was doing an interview once on the ABC and talking about the prospects for Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, to be the next UN Secretary General. And I just had a brain freeze. And I said, well, possibly, although I think her candidacy might run into problems because, I think there's a general sense that they're looking for a woman for the role. It was live on. I think I was on the drum.
What were you thinking of saying? Did you mean to say man?
No, I think I sort of forgot who I was. I think we'd gone from, because Rudd was also contending it, and that's why I was there. So I think my brain just hadn't caught up that we were then talking about Helen Clark. So I don't know. It was just like I was flustered. Full transparency. I'd actually been at University House and I'd had a couple of drinks as well, so probably didn't help.
Just to calm your nerves before you did that live TV.
Yeah. Well, no, they called me to say somebody had cancelled. Could I get up to the Parliament House at short notice to be on the drum talking?
And you were like, just a sec, let me finish this drink.
I was like, yeah, okay, why not?
So we've well and truly gone our 15 minutes, but I just wanted to basically go around and touch on not failures necessarily, but as well as failure, there can be disappointments in any career. And sometimes from day to day, you can be disappointed because you didn't get what you wanted or you didn't get what you expected or what you'd hoped for. And there is something I want to talk about in terms of disappointment and what it taught me. So one story on disappointment that I have is, I guess I was naive too. As a young junior person in a professional office, I put a lot of trust in the people above me and just assumed because of their maturity and their seniority that they would do the things that I expected of someone in that higher office. And I think I've learned over the last 10 years or so that people are just people. Even if they're senior people, it doesn't mean that they're the most fantastic and the best at their jobs. And they have, different priorities and other life concerns that you just don't have, particularly at a younger age. And so, in the past, there were occasions where I've expected certain things from the people above me, whether it's decision-making or leadership or mentorship. And sometimes, they haven't met those high expectations, but also sometimes the situation just doesn't allow them to perform any of those roles because they're in a very, very difficult situation of the majority of the time I have no visibility of. So, yes, in the past I've been disappointed by people above me and didn't get what I thought I needed out of them, which is an expectation I had, which was that they would train me and help me grow in the role so that I could make my next goal. And just sometimes in the roles that I've been in, there've been a lot of extremely busy offices that I've been in, whether it was Parliament House or working for government. And those people just don't have time to do that for all of their staff. They might be looking after 5 or 10 or more staff and they can't offer that role. And I think that's been the case at least for the last couple of years because in Australia we've had such a high turnover of prime ministers and ministers in portfolios and a worsening strategic environment. So there's been so much more to do, more policy work, and that sometimes some of the actual staffing stuff just falls down because there hasn't been the capacity for it. So one of the lessons I learned was not just to blindly think that my seniors would recognise burnout in me or would recognise when I needed support and encouragement, and to know where that line was for myself so that I looked after myself a little bit better and was more sustainable for them in the long term anyway. Because there's a line, where I think you have to find for yourself how much you can extend yourself, how many hours you can do, what stress levels that you can handle. And there's definitely something to be said for becoming more resilient to a higher workload and to more pressure. But there's also a point where you need to know where your breaking point is. And if you hit that point, it's a really good lesson to learn where that line is and how you got to that line. But for me, in a couple of the jobs that I've had, I just kept hitting that line because instead of taking a step back and recovering from it afterwards, I was told, this is a really good activity to build your resilience. But I think it needs to be a bit more tailored for individual staff members because I'm the type of person that doesn't like to tell my seniors when I've had too much. I just like to pretend like I can do everything. And humans really aren't like that, no matter what office you're working in. If it's the Prime Minister's office down, everyone has a breaking point. And if you reach that point, you're no longer useful to your office anyway because you've gone on stress leave or something. So I guess that was my one lesson learned from a disappointment, is that you need to know yourself better and you need to pull back at the times you really do need to pull back. So I just wanted to see if Lisa or Raoul, you had something similar where it was a disappointing work situation, it could have been really anything, and something that you learned from that experience that you now take forward with you in your career.
I think it's a really important point, Hayley. I mean, certainly for me, I think there is a tendency sometimes in this field, particularly when you're either starting out or you may be mid-career, and you feel the need to prove yourself, and you feel the way to do that is to say yes to everything and to say yes to every opportunity that you can handle it. This is the way that I prove that I'm committed to my job. This is the way that I demonstrate that I'm building my expertise. However, there are a lot of things going on outside life beyond these jobs. And I certainly, I feel like it's a cliche to say this, but it wasn't until I was much later in my career where I had effectively a huge disappointment, had worked on a significant project, had feedback come in that wasn't favourable on some aspects of it for various reasons, not necessarily the nature of the project, and just kind of thought, I've been burning myself out on this for weeks, and to the detriment of spending time with family, to the detriment of spending time with friends. And so I think it's really important that we do have conversations about this. I mean, this applies across work environments, and I think COVID has really highlighted that as well. But I think it's really important, and I think for those of us who are in different positions in our career, being in positions as managers as well, is having honest conversations with staff about time commitments, what's expected, when you need to come to me to tell me that there's too much on your plate. You know, that's something I would like to think that I've really tried to take on board and learn from in terms of having those open conversations with staff and colleagues, to make sure that, you know, there is a realisation that we're not meant to be working around the clock. As important as world developments are, as important as there will be times to surge and contribute and work long hours, that shouldn't be the normal operating tempo. But it's a hard lesson to learn, and often along the way you learn that, unfortunately, through missing things or through your health suffering as well. So I think that's a really important point to make in terms of bringing that to the forefront of sort of working in this environment, because you're quite right. Not everyone's going to recognise that when you're working with them.
Raoul, did you have one?
Yeah, I think I do. And mine was particularly sobering because it actually, I mean, I can really relate to both of those sort of experiences, and particularly to the well, you know, the challenging boss situation where you know, in some cases you know your superiors are not necessarily supporting or encouraging or promoting. They're in some cases actively undermining. I've been through that a few times, and it's been really, really tough. Again, it kind of instills a healthy sense of self-sufficiency and that form of detachment that I was talking about. But no, the really difficult one that I had to face was really a problem in my own self, which was to really face up to some of the, you know, some of the sort of attributes in my personality that were really, I think, having a very detrimental effect on my professional life. I did 4 years of a PhD program, and you know, I'm not Dr. Heinrichs, so you know, I fell out of it, and you know, it was you know, for a little while, there were all sorts of frustrations, including with supervision and with the way the program was structured. But ultimately, the failure, you know, and this is the thing about grad school and about doctoral study, is the failure is yours. You know, the glory is yours, and so is the failure, and it very much was mine. And you know, I had to sort of confront what had been really, I think, a long-standing issue for me, which was, well, there were two things sort of, and they're related. I'm not necessarily exactly sure how they're related, but one is a sort of an avoidant type personality where I prefer to, I can really compartmentalize and set things aside and distract myself. And the other is a real, you know, a bit of perfectionism, which somewhat counterintuitively can have a very, well, for me, can sometimes have a very paralyzing effect. I think because I mean, the upshot is that you become a world-class procrastinator, and that the you know, starting any task becomes very difficult because you're compromising with the idea of perfection, the beauty of whatever you're doing that exists in your mind, you know, and
actually putting it on paper, it could reveal that it's not exactly perfect in the way you wanted it.
Exactly. You have to confront head on, you know, your limitations, and you know, in some cases it can be easier not to start. So you know, in my PhD program, although I did make a start and make some effort, I did spend a lot of time writing op-eds and doing blog posts and really annoying the hell out of my supervisors. You know, building a kind of career as a sort of international strategic commentator, and also tutoring, which I loved and which was much more you know, conducive to my skills and stuff. So, you know, and I, you know, even today I can't say I've necessarily worked out the secret recipe to those. I think I'm in a job now where the tasks are much more discreet and much more, they're short term and
self-contained.
Self-contained, which is really good, and you can just kind of launch into them and cross them off lists and things like that. But that certainly was a disappointment, and one which I continue to kind of try to be mindful of.
It's so true though, because what you're really getting at too is this idea of there's something that you want to pursue in your career because you think that is what you want for yourself, but the actual physical task of doing it is not really your personality or your skill set. And I've experienced that as well, wishing that I was going to be something, but then, so for instance, when I was a teenager, I really wanted to work for NGOs and not-for-profits. When I finally did work for them, I realized these are not my people. This is not my kind of clan. Yeah. They weren't, the job itself was interesting, but the type of people, the actual culture of the organization just wasn't really well suited to my personality. As much as you can adapt, if, it might just not be what you expect when you get there. So look, I think we've covered a lot of ground between the three of us, and there's a lot to take out of all of those things. And to anyone considering a career in our field of foreign affairs, strategic studies,
highly thoroughly deterred by now, aren't they?
Well, first of all, please expect failure no matter what career you choose.
Embrace failure.
Yeah, and that everyone has it much more than they have successes, which is all you see on their LinkedIn or their Facebook or social media pages, that there's a lot of crying on the floor or in coffee shops or reflection in the walls of Parliament House. That you're not always going to make it the first time, but that even when you don't, you too take something out of those experiences. They're not wasted experiences, and you do get stronger from them as long as you keep moving forward. I think if you stay stagnant and kind of resolved to your fate, that can be the worst thing. But if you really want something, you just keep trying. That's what I learned. And now I'm so happy.
Well, and I think that, you're quite right there, Hayley. I guess the challenge is there when people are talking to others about their careers, feel, I guess, a bit, bold and ask if they can share a story where they've really faced a challenge or something they've struggled with, or where they didn't get the job that they wanted to do. Because I think, for me, I was reflecting back on this conversation today going, why don't we like sharing these things? And I think part of it is because, I certainly thought people would think less of me if I said I didn't get that job, I wasn't successful at this. No one's going to consider me for something else moving forward. And, I say that as someone who's, come from a background of privilege and, been quite fortunate in the way my career has unfolded. But I think it is, it's that vulnerability, and you can go into all the discussions around that are really challenging. But I think the more that we can have conversations about what doesn't appear on our resume, hopefully the better that can be for those that are trying to figure out where to move to next in their careers.
Definitely. Well, Raoul and Lisa, thank you so much for opening up and sharing those stories. Honestly, I think this is the most important episode I've recorded this year because it's providing people with a skill set rather than just telling them some analysis which they could get from a lot of other sources. So thank you both, and let's all hope and pray for a better 2022 with less failure and less disappointment.
Here's to that. Thanks so much, Hayley. Thanks, Raoul.
Thanks, folks. This was really fun. Appreciate the opportunity.